Chapter 161. The War. Blood Moon. Content warning for wolfy gore. Remus had spent a full month in Greyback's pack before he was truly given a reason to leave. He woke late one morning to find himself almost alone. Confused, he sat up staring around. He'd grown used to having Castor and Jeremy nearby. He felt horribly exposed without their body heat. Father summoned them. A voice came out of the gloom. Remus raised his palm to create a heat-free flame for light, as Castor had taught him. It was easier than Lumos, though not as bright. Gaia stepped out from the shadows of one of the chambers. He stared down at Remus. Father came this morning. Summoned Castor and Livia. Only them. I suppose Castor is forgiven now. Will they be back soon? Remus asked warily, drawing his cloak round his shoulders protectively. I don't expect so, Gaius mused. He was fiddling with something shiny, kept glancing down at it. They've gone to meet the Dark Lord. What? It's almost the moon. He'll have plans for the pack. Plans? Reality came clanging down on Remus's head like glass shattering, like a car crash. You know, Gaius said, apparently uninterested in Remus's crisis of consciousness, I always wondered why Father turned 3 males. I thought perhaps he wished us to learn to lead together, to share the burden of responsibility. But now I realize. He means us to compete. What do you want, Gaius? Remus stood up, squaring his shoulders to remind Gaius that he was bigger and stronger when he wanted to be. Want me to sing you another song? Gaius sneered at him, cheeks red. He backed away. You will not triumph, he said. He threw the shiny object down at Remus's feet before turning to leave, and it made a hard metal sound. It was Remus's pocket watch. Hoi! Remus yelled, stooping to grab it up, but Gaius was gone. Remus slumped against the wall, running his fingers through his grimy hair. His heart raced, his breathing quickened, and he began to panic. Shit. Shit, shit, shit. Of course they were still working with Voldemort.
The war hadn't stopped simply because Remus was there.
He felt stupid and naive, and worst of all, he felt guilty. He was supposed to be on a bloody mission, but he hadn't been thinking of the Order, not really. He'd been more concerned about protecting the pack than getting back to his friends, his true family. All this time, Remus had thought himself as a victim, when really he was the worst kind of traitor. He shrugged off his fur cloak. He didn't want to look like them. He badly wanted to see Sirius. After weeks of suppressing it, his longing burst up like a geyser, so that he couldn't get a grip on it and squash it back down again. Sirius would know what to do, or at least he'd make Remus feel better about everything. Remus looked down at his watch, the only connection he still had to his friends. The gold had lost its luster, and he rubbed it on his filthy trouser leg to see if that helped. Then he opened and closed it a few times, running the pads of his thumbs along the smooth vine leaf engraving. It had stopped working the day he used it to escape his cell. He squeezed all the magic out of it like a sponge. Another betrayal. Once he'd at least calmed his breathing down. Jesus Christ, what I wouldn't do for a fag. Remus tried to think rationally. His first instinct was to get out immediately, just walk into the woods and disapparate. But then what? Explain to Moody and Ferox that while he'd had a lovely few weeks away, things had got a bit too scary, so he'd turned tail at the first opportunity. No. If Greyback was meeting with Voldemort, then that had to mean an attack was coming. Remus couldn't let that happen. He would wait at least to find out if Castor would tell him anything.
In the meantime, Remus did his best to conjure up a happy memory. He would need to send a Patronus as soon as possible.
Brothers, sisters, gather near. Livia's voice inside his head had to be one of the least pleasant experiences Remus had since joining the pack. It worked, though. He scrambled up the stairs of the crypt into the ruined church where the others were congregating. Greyback stood by the pulpit, Castor and Livia on either side of him, backs straight and heads high. My children, Greyback addressed them all, raising his arms like an evangelist preacher. The moon approaches. Our time is near. There was a murmur of excitement at this. For many, the full moons represented a chance to be free, to be one's true self. Greyback raised a finger to silence them. He smiled paternally. I have spoken with our benefactor. This moon, We shall feast on our enemies. We've been given the gift of prey." Some of the pack members cheered and whooped, chattering with even more excitement. "No, no," Remus's stomach lurched. "Oh no, oh no." "Livia and Castor will lead you," Greyback said. "You will bring the girl child to me. The parents you may keep for yourselves." More cheering. Not everyone. Remus saw a few of the younger ones glancing at themselves shiftily, and Jeremy's eyes were practically burning a hole in Castor's head. Not all of them, Remus thought. They can be saved. They can. Remus Lupin. A voice popped into his head. He blinked, stunned. It was Castor. "It is not safe to speak of this here. You will join me in the forest." Remus looked over at Castor, who was staring blankly ahead, as always inscrutable. He hadn't tried communicating like that before, but the pack was close enough and the magic of the forest was pressing in, so he concentrated hard. "Yes, I understand." Castor made no sign that he'd heard, so Remus just had to hope. Greyback left shortly after that, giving Remus a cruel wink as he passed. "Your time to shine, cub," he said. Remus knew he ought to nod or something, but he was too tense and just stared stiffly back. Castor announced he was going hunting, and Remus quickly agreed to join him. Livia gave them both an appraising look. "Don't tire yourselves, brothers. We have such games ahead of us." They walked through the woods in silence. It was late afternoon and quite mild for April, the sun lowering but still bright. They had very little rain so far this year, but that hadn't stopped the trees and plants round them from exploding into life. Everything was lush and green and bountiful, and as they approached a small clearing, Remus saw that the bluebells had begun to spring up, and the woodland floor ahead of them was carpeted in a glorious haze of soft mauve. "Won't you miss this?" Castor said quietly. He obviously judged them far enough away from Greyback. "Yes," Remus replied. He meant it. He had hated nature all his life, even the forbidden forest. He loved London, the concrete and the pollution and the noise. But the past month had changed him, and he knew how much he would miss the peace and quiet, and feeling so close to the earth. "But your time with us grows short," Castor said. "I think perhaps all our time is short now." He sighed heavily and looked at Remus with completely human eyes, grey and penitent. "I am ready to defy my father." "Do you mean, will you help me?" "We shall help each other, for the good of the pack. I have a plan, Remus Lupin, but you must listen to me, and you must obey me. I need to know that you will do what needs to be done." "I will never kill for him," Remus said fiercely. "But you might kill," Castor responded, raising an eyebrow. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, and Remus didn't deny it. Thursday, 12th of April, 1979. There were no goodbyes, of course. Remus did not even know who was on their side, his and Castor's. No names were spoken, he just had to have faith. On the morning of the full moon, Remus crept as far away from the pack as he could to cast his Patronus. He hoped that the others wouldn't pick up on the smell, which was powerful and sure to attract attention. He'd never sent a message via Patronus before, and once again he regretted the creature's fearsome size and aspect. Hopefully it wouldn't be too terrifying for Sirius to hear Remus's voice coming from the giant silver wolf's jaws. He could only manage 3 words. Castle, tomorrow, dawn. And that was his escape route taken care of, if he survived the night. Castor promised, Remus made him swear on their very blood, that if Remus did not live, then he would get a message to Sirius and the Potters. There was no other way, Remus decided. He had to be there for the attack. The last time he'd warned the Order about werewolves, nothing had been done, so he would have to do it himself, and damn the consequences. Obviously he'd prefer not to die, though. An hour or so before moonrise, the pack apparated together. It was just as well that Remus hadn't run away to tell Moody at his first opportunity, because he had absolutely no idea where they were going. He was forced to side along with Livia, and they landed together on a soft, mossy patch of grass. Remus wrenched his arm away from her and stared round at his new surroundings. It was such a weird place. Just a flat plain of grass, a few trees, a fence. Ah. He realized stupidly that they were in a park. Man-made nature. The whole place smelled human and mugglish. The rest of the pack was arriving around them, one by one, with a crack and a thud. "That's the place," Castor said, addressing everyone. He pointed over the fence to a row of houses across the road. The park was in a quiet Muggle cul-de-sac. Remus kept as close to the fence as he dared and peered over the building. Had his parents lived in a similar house once? It looked like the sort of place Hope belonged. It was a small detached house. The front door was a cheery shade of green, and the porch light glowed soft in the amber twilight. Remus could make out the silhouette of someone moving in one of the upstairs windows. The pale pink blind was drawn down, so he could only see shadows. That must be the child's room, he thought, with a terrible wave of nausea. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. If he had to kill Livia, if he had to die himself, he wouldn't let... Wait a minute. A gust of wind blew a scent in his direction, one he recognized. He sniffed the air again. What was that? Something he knew? It smelled almost like Sirius, almost. Old blood, old magic. A relative? Not Regulus. He wouldn't be caught dead on a street this mugglish, nor either of his parents. It was feminine, too. It was more like Narcissa, or surely not Andromeda? He couldn't be sure, but he'd only met her once when he was 13. But she had a daughter who would be about 5 or 6 now. Heart pounding, Remus desperately wanted to get closer to find out more. Then, in an amazing stroke of luck, the green door opened, letting light out into the street. A man stepped out, carrying a shiny black bin bag. He walked to the end of the garden path, opened the dustbin lid, dropped the bag inside, then returned to the house. It was Ted Tonks. No, 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 Remus thought to himself. If something happened to Andromeda, to her little girl, Sirius would never forgive him. Remus didn't know if he would ever forgive himself. "Remus," Castor whispered from the bushes behind him. "It's almost time." Remus turned and nodded. He hoped this would work. He'd never been so close to praying in his life. A stab of pain shot through his back. The moon was rising. He backed into the park where a few of the others had curled up on the ground preparing for the agonies of transformation. Remus looked at Castor standing beside him. It was a peculiar sensation. He'd transformed in front of the Marauders before, but never with others who were experiencing the same thing. Castor caught his eye and, seeming to understand at once, reached out his hand.
Remus took it gratefully and gripped it hard, clenching his teeth as the pain swept through him.
Castor gripped back, sharing his suffering, but also lending strength. They both fell to their knees at the same time, and Remus remembered no more. The wolf stretched its limbs and sniffed at the night air. Prey, pack, magic. He rolled over in the grass, pleased to be free, unencumbered by human worries. His packmate nudged him, huffing softly, and he remembered. He had something to do. This was not a night for playing, or for hunting. The she-wolf and the one that hated him both snapped at the others, and the young ones ducked their heads, lowering their haunches. But he would not. He was not a cub. He was full-grown. He was as strong as them. The packmate with the scarred nose smelled good. He was strong, too. He growled at the others, so the wolf did, too, puffing up his body and showing all his teeth, so that they knew. The scarred one gave out a bark then, and turned away, running for the trees. Some of the others followed, confused.
The dark wolf, the wolf who hated him, snarled and leapt at the scarred one, onto his back. They grappled, turning over in the grass, growling and snapping.
The she-wolf watched. She sat and yawned. She need not involve herself. The rest of the pack watched avidly, panting and yapping as blood was drawn. He wanted to help, to jump in and start biting, but the scarred one needed to win it himself. It was his fight. The scent in the air changed, and the she-wolf stood, ears up, tail swishing. A human. They'd been heard. She began to stalk toward the fence, hunting, as the stupid human shouted in its stupid human language. Not knowing why, he howled, long and hard, loud as he could. The she-wolf whipped round, growling fiercely at him, pulling rank, but he howled again. The human retreated fast. They knew now. They would bring back others. He'd endangered the pack. The she-wolf barked at the Dark One, but he was already pinned to the ground by the Scarred One. Victory. The young wolves looked up at the Scarred One now, sniffing at him and lowering their heads. The Scarred One barked, then climbed off the Dark One. He turned and began to walk away. Some followed. The pack divided. The she-wolf ran after the Scarred One to bring him back, to restore order, but she could not catch them. They were a new pack now. Unless she killed the Scar One, they would not follow anyone else. He wanted to go too. He wanted to run with them forever and be their leader and chase deer through the dark nights.
But no, he had to do this first. He had to protect... What was it? It was so hard to think when the delicious scent of human meat was so close, coming in on all sides.
The Dark One limped to its feet. Remus growled. It snarled at him, jaws frothing, eyes baleful. He remembered now. Protect the pack. He pounced, jaws wide and claws bared. All he knew was pain. Pain and blood as Remus's body pulled itself back into its human shape. He screamed and Gaius's blood ran down his gullet, rich and warm. It was in his teeth, under his tongue. It was everywhere. And Gaius's body lay there, limp and pale, throat dark and glistening. There was no time for shock.
The moon was setting, and people were coming, and Remus wasn't even fully human yet, but there was no time. He squeezed his eyes shut, gritted his teeth, and apparated.
Crack. He landed flat on his face with a hard grunt. His ankle cracked sickeningly against a rock. He gasped, rolling into a ball, tears springing into his eyes as he vowed never again to apparate right after a transformation again. His whole foot throbbed, shooting all the way up his shin, making him feel giddy. He was still sticky with blood, and without any clothes on, all he could do was curl up in pain in the grass. Was he even in Cornwall? He couldn't tell. Where was the castle? Fuck! He sobbed, exhausted and defeated. Moony? A shout came from up over the side of the hill. Remus rolled onto his back and closed his eyes, so relieved he thought he'd faint. Sirius! He called back as the heavy footsteps pounded closer. And then he was there, and oh God, Remus just about fell apart. Sirius threw his cloak over him and pulled him close and wrapped his arms round him. Remus clutched him back, trembling, the pain in his leg now threatening to overwhelm him. You came back? Sirius gasped, voice shrill. You came back! Course I did, Remus said woozily. Are you bleeding? Oh, my blood. And then everything was going dark round the edges, and he was so exhausted he closed his eyes, and nothing more.
Chapter 162. The War. Moony's Story. He came to in a small white room, with a low ceiling striped with black beams. There was a little square window, but the curtains were drawn over. Someone had washed the blood off him, thank goodness, though he could still smell it, faintly, and taste it too. He was lying in a single bed, and other than a little bedside table with an old lamp on it, there wasn't much else in the room. The door was slightly ajar, and Remus could hear voices in the corridor outside. "Marlene's here," James's voice came through clearly. "Should I let her up? Did you ask him any questions?"
Yeah, send her up. He's not awake,
Sirius said, his voice sounding odd.
But it's definitely him. Has to be.
You're sure?
The first thing he said when he landed was fuck. I'm pretty certain,
Sirius snapped. Fair, James replied without humour. He lowered his voice to a whisper.
Padfoot. All that blood. And with the attack last night. Let's just see what he has to say before we jump to any conclusions, shall we? Send Marlene up. But if it's not safe, then I'll stay in the bloody room. Can we please just get someone to look at him, for fuck's sake? He hasn't even got a wand.
Okay, James relented. God, Remus thought, as shame settled over him like dust. They think I'm not me. They think I'm a spy. How bad had the war become in the month he'd been away? He racked his brain quickly for a way to prove his identity. The thought of Sirius not trusting him was too painful to bear. There was a mess of footsteps in the hall outside, and finally the door opened. Remus tried to sit up at once, pulling himself up by his arms as Sirius entered the room.
Padfoot, I swear it's me. It's Moony. I helped you make the Marauders map, and we put rose hips in Snivelus's bed, and we went skating on the ice at Christmas, and I hated it, but you were really good, and... Shh, Moony,
Sirius soothed, sitting on the bed carefully and placing gentle hands on his shoulder.
Lie down, for fuck's sake. Godric knows what you broke apparating like that, you silly sod. You know it's me.
Remus gripped Sirius's arms, but allowed himself to be put back to bed.
Of course I do.
Sirius leaned over and kissed his forehead.
I'd know you anywhere. Look, sorry about Prongs. He's just on edge. Things have been a bit...
All right, give him some room. Sirius whipped round as Marlene stormed into the room, green healer's robes flying and leather bag in hand. She shoved Sirius off the bed and leaned over Remus, laying a cool hand on his forehead and looking into his eyes, her freckled face full of sweet concern. She smiled.
Hello, sweetheart, she said softly. Where have you been, eh? You've had us all worried sick. Hi, Marlene.
Remus smiled back fondly.
Did you qualify as a healer while I was gone?
Hardly, she laughed. Still very much a novice, but I'm the best the Order could do at short notice, so... She straightened up, hands on her hips. Right, what's the damage?
Hurt my ankle.
Remus reached down to pull up the blankets over his sore foot. It looked awful in the light of day, all swollen and black with bruising. Sirius covered his mouth, but Marlene just tutted. Easy enough. She tapped it with her wand, and Remus felt a funny ticklish feeling before pop, and it was good as new. You'll still need to rest, Marlene cautioned.
You're a legend, Miles,
Remus said gratefully, then began to cough, that raspy bark he'd almost got used to now.
Sorry,
he spluttered, eyes watering.
Got a bit of a cough.
Sirius was wincing and looked more distressed than ever, hand still over his mouth. Marlene pulled down the bedsheets and lay her head directly on Remus's bare chest, listening. Bit of a cough, my arse, she tutted, surfacing. You got a stonking great chest infection is what? She began emptying her bag, pulling out ointments and potion bottles. I'll have to go ask someone at St. Mungo's what's best for that. I haven't done infections yet. Now, Madame Pomfrey asked me to make sure you got this. It's her own sleeping draught. I'm working on one myself, but hers will be stronger. Don't give it to him yet! Suddenly, James was in the room, starting forward with his arm out. Everyone turned to look at him, and he rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Sorry. It's just I finally got a hold of Mad-Eye, and he's on his way.
It's fine,
Remus said to the room. Marlene tutted again. She set the potion bottle down on the bedside table. One of you make sure he drinks the whole thing as soon as possible, okay? She gave James and Sirius a severe look, and they both nodded earnestly. Off to go to work before I'm missed, she said, straightening up once more. She squeezed Remus's hand.
So happy to have you back, darling.
He squeezed back, feeling a bit better about everything. They cared about him. He was safe with them. He lay back on his pillow and tried to focus on that feeling. James and Sirius stood about awkwardly.
Hi, Prongs,
Remus tried, a bit wary. Hiya, Moony. James smiled, his eyes dark and tired. You all right?
Felt worse.
James made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh.
Where are we, anyway?
Remus asked, looking around at the poky little room.
Cornwall,
Sirius said.
Remember the pub near the castle? Rented a room. When you got here, I didn't want to move you. Seemed like the best place. Out of the way. Does anyone else know?
No, James said. Only us, Marlene and Moody. Things have been hard, and with the attack last night, we thought...
Attack?
Remus sat up again as the events of the night came flooding back in a riot of hot blood and teeth and hair.
Shit, what happened? Was anyone... Not on our side,
Sirius said. That didn't make Remus feel any better, but he tried to look happy about it. He couldn't let his friends know just how blurry the lines between our side and their side had become for him. Moony, James started. Last night, were you there? The door swung open once more, creaking loudly, and Alistair Moody came hobbling into the room, his face set with a look of grim determination. James and Sirius backed out of the way as Mad-Eye approached Remus's bed. Remus's first instinct was to duck under his blankets and hide like a little kid. "Lupin?" Moody nodded, his electric blue eye whirring in its socket, giving him a very thorough once-over. "You made it back, then?"
"Yeah,"
Remus croaked. Moody held his wand up, pointing it in Remus's face.
"Oi!"
Sirius started, but James held out an arm to stop him. Moody fixed Remus with a very serious gaze.
"Mother's maiden name?"
Jenkins," Remus stuttered, terrified. Moody nodded and lowered his wand.
"No offence,"
he said, glancing at Sirius.
"Protocol."
"Right," Remus swallowed, heart pounding.
"How are you? Been seen to?"
"Marlene was here a minute ago," James said. "She'll be back later."
"No one else, do you hear?" Moody said. "Not until I say so. We need to limit his exposure for now, until the furor's died down."
He waved his wand and a chair appeared from thin air. Moody sat down and looked at Remus once more.
"Potter, Black, you can go." "No,"
Sirius said, raising his chin. His defiant look hadn't changed since he was 11.
"I'm not going anywhere."
Moody gave him another look, his tongue playing in the corner of his mouth.
"Fine,"
he grunted.
"But keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear a peep. Got it?"
I better go," James said, rubbing the back of his head again. "Sorry, Moony, I need to get home."
"Of course,"
Remus said, though he didn't really understand. Did James no longer trust him? James said something to Sirius before leaving, but Remus didn't catch it and didn't try to eavesdrop. He was too busy holding his nerve against Moody. He wasn't up for a battle of wills, not after the last few weeks. Now that he knew the building they were in was Muggle, he felt the absence of magic more keenly. He'd been used to the enchanted forest with its unending pool of unshared power. Back in the real world, everything felt so mundane. He felt weaker than ever and began to cough again. James left and Sirius handed Remus a glass of water.
"This can't take too long,"
Remus said to Moody.
"He's supposed to rest after a full moon. Marlene said—" "Not a peep, Black!"
Moody snapped, his blue eye fixing Sirius with a hard stare, the normal brown one still watching Remus. Sirius was quiet, but he was clearly not happy about it. He folded his arms petulantly and looked away. Remus felt a rush of love for him, the spoilt brat.
"I was there last night,"
Remus said quickly, to get things moving. He thought it was probably the best to be as honest as possible from the beginning.
"I was at the Tonks house. I know what happened. Well, most of it. Did anyone... "One body recovered," Moody said. "One of Greyback's."
"Gaius," Remus said. He wasn't sure how he felt. He'd killed somebody.
"Let's not start there," Moody said, watching his face. "I want to start at the beginning. Where have you been for the past month? Leave nothing out."
Remus was weak and exhausted and sore, but he was not an idiot. He left plenty out, but he also said a lot more than was probably safe. He didn't look at Sirius the whole time. He knew that would make things impossible. He explained how the pack had kidnapped him and locked him up for a week and a half, how he'd finally met Greyback. He heard Sirius breathe in sharply at this, but Moody's expression didn't even flicker. He told them most of the things Greyback had said, though he knew none of it was useful to anyone except him. He confirmed that the pack had been working with Voldemort, keeping the old family scared enough to stay loyal.
"You were in prison the whole time?"
Moody asked.
No.
Remus twisted his mouth nervously.
"They broke my wand, but I could have left at any time. I didn't because I thought... Well, I knew it was only a matter of time before they planned an attack, and I wanted to learn as much as I could."
He kept his voice steady the whole time and hoped he was still a convincing liar. Moody did not comment.
"And the attack?" "Right, yeah," Remus nodded. "I had to go with them because Kaz, one of the other werewolves, he was planning to break from the pack. He wanted to be peaceful, to get away from Greyback. He was my ally."
Remus felt Sirius's eyes on him and hoped it was all in his head.
So I helped him and he helped me. He led the others away and I stayed back to stop anyone from trying to attack the house. While you were a wolf? Yes. I can think better when there are other wolves there. I tried to warn Mr. and Mrs. Tonks. I howled so they'd know they were in danger. Ah, so that was you. Moody nodded. Ted said something about that. You've seen them? Are they okay? Shaken up, but no harm done. Moody gave a curt nod. How many of Greyback's pack have defected? I don't know. At least half. Maybe there are only 4 or 5 left who are loyal. Good to know. Can you give me names? They didn't use any names. Another lie, but he just couldn't do it. Right, Moody nodded. He watched Remus for a bit longer, then he sniffed and stood up. Lie low for a bit, eh? I'll be in touch. He turned to leave. Wait! Remus reached out. Moody turned back, a curious look on his face. Remus bit his lip. The body, he said. Gaius. That was me. I killed him. Saying it out loud made it distressingly real. He felt queasy and he didn't think he'd be able to look at Sirius in the eye ever again. Moody kept looking at him. He tilted his head. While you were a wolf? Yeah. And he was a wolf, trying to attack a young family? Yeah, but... This is a war, Lupin. Get some rest. Don't dwell on it. And he left, and that was it. Everything Remus had put himself through for almost 30 days boiled down to a few key tactical points. He fidgeted with the blanket. It was old and bobbly and reminded him of the rough army-style blankets he'd grown up with. Sirius was still standing by, watching him, but Remus couldn't look up. He just couldn't. Thankfully, Sirius broke the silence first. Got your Patronus. Bloody hell, where'd you learn to do that? Oh, Remus nodded, still looking down. Yeah, I don't know. I'd seen Ferox do it once. Without your wand? I didn't need it, not always. Oh. More silence. And then... I missed you so fucking much, Sirius burst out, with such force and passion that Remus finally looked up at him. His eyes were wide and shimmering with tears. He looked as exhausted as Remus felt, and Remus realized that he must have been up all night too. I missed you too. Sirius bolted toward Remus, arms out, but hung back at the last moment. Can I... Is it okay? Remus nodded, reaching for him, and Sirius came over and enveloped him in a hug that went on for long, wonderful minutes. Remus felt as if he'd finally been given permission to exhale, and he closed his eyes and felt the warm, comforting weight of Sirius against him. I'm sorry, Remus whispered into Sirius's hair. I'm so sorry I was gone so long. Sirius pulled away, finally wiping his eyes briskly. You better have this potion. He reached for the bottle and uncorked it. Thanks, Remus said, too tired to argue. He took the potion and gulped it down in a few seconds. Shall I let you rest? Sirius asked anxiously. Remus shook his head vehemently. No, please stay. Will you lie here with me for a bit? There's not much room. Calling me fat? Remus poked his tongue out, shuffling aside to make space. Sirius grinned at him and lay down. He put an arm gently across Remus's shoulder, and they lay on their sides, facing each other. Does James hate me? Remus asked finally. What? Sirius frowned. Oh God, he was so beautiful this close up. How had Remus forgotten? No, of course not. He's got a lot on his mind. His parents aren't well. Oh no, what's wrong? I think they're just old, Sirius said sadly. The war. It's been so much harder lately. Please tell me. You should sleep. Please. Sirius sighed. He looked down, then back up, and his eyes were shining once more. We lost the Pruitts. Kid and Fab. No! It was awful. 5 Death Eaters. 5! I can't believe it. Is Molly okay? I don't think any of us are. Oh, Sirius. Remus hugged him again. I wish I could have been with you. I thought...
Sirius shut his eyes, then shook his head, hair rustling against the pillow.
No, never mind. It's over now. You're here. You're safe. I'm here,
Remus repeated, feeling the sleeping draught start to kick in. Sirius stroked his hair gently.
Remus.
Remus shifted, making himself more comfortable.
Please call me Moony. No one has for so long. Moony.
Sirius leaned forward and kissed his cheek very gently.
I love you. I love you too,
Remus smiled, slipping into a warm and happy dream.
Chapter 163. The War. Late Spring, 1979. Warnings. There is a brief suggestion of alcohol dependency in this chapter, as well as a mention of cancer and the death of close family members. They stayed in the room above the pub for 2 more nights. Marlene came back on the first evening, as good as her word, and brought a potion for Remus's chest infection. She prescribed rest, but the next day Remus was going mad from being cooped up, so he and Sirius caught the bus to the beach. It was too cold for swimming, being April, so they just walked. It was very quiet out for the tourist season, so it was okay to hold hands, too, for a little bit. Remus closed his eyes and breathed in the sea air, smiling. The sky was grey, threatening rain, but wind was fresh on his face, and he felt better. "When we get home," Sirius said brightly, "we'll go to Ollivander's to get you a new wand." "Great," Remus nodded. He hadn't done any magic since he'd been back. Didn't trust himself. "That's if Mary'll hold off on your welcome home party," Sirius chuckled. "She was going bonkers worrying. I think she must still have a thing for you." "Ah," Remus replied.
And Lily, obviously. She really wants to tell you something, but she said she had to wait until we were all in the same room.
Can't wait for everything to be back to normal. Back to being Marauders, eh? Yeah. Do you remember what sort of wand Lyle had? Maybe you can get the same one again. Nope. Moony? Are you okay? Yeah. Sirius was quiet after that, and Remus felt guilty. After his brusque debriefing with Moody, Remus hadn't been in a very talkative mood. He was too anxious to say very much. He didn't know what Sirius might think of him, and on top of that, Remus was struggling more than he thought he would, being away from the pack. He was thrilled to be back with Sirius, of course, but at the same time he felt he was missing something. He didn't want Sirius to worry, so he did his best to be normal. "So nice to be outside," he commented as they walked. "Are you sure you're my Moony?" Sirius teased, pretending to be affronted. "My Moony hates going outside." "Well, spend a week locked up in a dungeon and tell me how you feel about fresh air," Remus muttered. Sirius stopped and looked at him, his mouth slightly open, expression hurt. "Sorry," Remus said guiltily. He took Sirius's hand again. "I didn't mean that." He'd been doing that a lot since he got back. Snapping. The smallest thing might send him off, and Sirius was bearing the brunt. "It's okay," Sirius replied shakily. "I shouldn't make fun of you. After everything." "No, I don't want... You shouldn't have to treat me like I'm fragile or something. I just need to get over it. It's my own fault." Sirius didn't say anything for a long time. Remus fought the urge to probe his mind, as the werewolves had taught him to do. He didn't know if it worked on non-werewolves, but he did know that Sirius had extremely strong feelings about having his private thoughts invaded. "You don't have to get over it," Sirius said finally, "but it might help to talk." "About what?" "What happened? In the pack." "I've talked about that already. I've told Moody everything. You were there." "Remus?" Sirius raised his voice slightly. "Come on. You didn't tell him everything. I know you." "Everything important to the war effort," Remus said firmly. "So nothing else happened then?" Sirius let go of Remus's hand because his own hands were suddenly in the air, gesturing wildly. "They just locked you up, then let you go, and it was all fine." "Obviously not." Remus folded his arms, suddenly feeling the chill. "But no one wants to hear about things like that." "Maybe I want to hear." Here we go. Remus rolled his eyes. Well then, what do you want to hear? Why did you go in the first place? Why didn't you come back to me? I knew it, Remus said, tightening his arms round his body. You're angry with me. I'm not. I'm just... That's what you meant, wasn't it? The night I got back. What are you talking about? You know, you came back. That's what you said. You thought I wasn't going to. You thought I'd left for good. Remus was shouting all of a sudden, and he wasn't sure how he'd got so angry, but now it was just burning him up. Of course I didn't, Sirius shouted back. I just didn't know what to think. Do you know what it's like for me? You just disappeared and no one would let me look for you. And fucking Ferox wouldn't tell me anything. And James was a mess with his parents getting sick and the fucking Pruitts. Sirius didn't shout often, not as often as Remus anyway, and his voice got very high very quickly, suddenly sounding incredibly posh and haughty. This just riled Remus up even more. Oh, poor you! Jesus, I thought you got over this spoiled brat routine by now. We're not 12 anymore, Black. Sirius's mouth fell open now, utterly affronted. Remus felt more alive than he had in days, but he wasn't ever going to admit it. He just kept shouting, shattering the peace of the empty beach, voice ringing against the dark, wet sand. I'm sorry if I'm not like you. I don't want to whinge about every unpleasant thing that happens to me. Like what? Sirius yelled, cheeks red and eyes bright, so that for a moment Remus questioned whether Sirius was enjoying this just as much as he was. Go on! If I'm so selfish and terrible, please enlighten me on the true nature of noble suffering, Remus. I know that's your specialty. Oh, up yours! Well, why didn't you come back? Because they were fucking with my head. Remus practically screamed this, the waves seeming to crash louder and seagulls crying overhead in answer. He was ablaze, filled with words that came tumbling out of him as soon as he thought them. Because I never felt like that before. They were my family, and we were the same, and we were all at home, and it was like the only place in the world I was meant to be. All that, it was all that, except... And now tears were coming, scalding hot. Except he was there. That fucking monster. He was so evil, and I was so scared, and I wanted to come home to you. I did. But I couldn't just leave them with a man like that. And they could do things I didn't know I could do. They taught me. And I just didn't know who I was anymore. He wiped his face, the tears dripping off of his chin. He looked Sirius in the eye. I don't know who I am. They stared at each other as the echoes subsided. Remus was breathing heavily, his cheeks hot, but he felt good, relieved. Finally Sirius spoke. He put his hands in his pockets, squinted around off into the distance. He smiled. Why is it always this beach, eh? What? Remus blinked, caught off guard. Sirius looked at him, eyes twinkling. Why is this the beach where we have all the big revelations? Maybe we're just dramatic. How very dare you! Sirius was smirking, and Remus laughed despite himself. Well, Sirius said, feel better? Yeah. Oh, wait a minute, did you just deliberately try to piss me off? No. Sirius looked away again, piously. Not at first. Dickhead. It worked. Remus didn't respond because he really did feel better and he didn't want to fight again. They kept walking and eventually reached roughly the spot where they had all camped out 2 years ago. The wind was kicking up, sweeping across the grassy sand dunes, and the campsite was empty. It didn't look like the same place. Think we'll ever come back here? Remus asked, hands in his pockets to stop his coat flapping in the breeze. I hope so, Sirius replied. It's my Patronus thought, this place. Is it? Remus looked at him, surprised. Haven't had any better summers yet? Fair point. Oi, look! Sirius wandered off toward a group of rocks, bent, and picked up a big long stick. He waggled it at Remus, grinning. Want to play fetch? Remus laughed. Go on, then. Sirius glanced round covertly to confirm they were alone, then transformed into Padfoot. Remus was grateful. He'd done enough talking now, and it was a relief to just play with canine Sirius for a few hours. The big black dog raced up and down the beach, chased waves, played fetch, and generally had an excellent time, and on the bus back to the pub, both of them fell asleep. It wasn't until much later that night, after dinner— oh, how Remus had missed real food, mashed potato, sausages, gravy— when they were getting ready for bed that Sirius brought it up again. Remus was yawning as he crawled under the covers, and Sirius got in beside him quietly, turning off the bedside lamp. The bed was so narrow that Remus had to lie with his back to the wall, an arm round Sirius's waist, and a face full of silky black hair. She didn't really mind. "I know who you are," Sirius whispered into the empty quiet of the dark bedroom. "Hmm?" Remus asked, sleepy and confused. Sirius pulled Remus's hand to his mouth and kissed his fingers. "You said you don't know who you are anymore, but I do. You're my Moony. Always will be. Okay?" "Okay, Padfoot." For now it was enough. Moody got word to them that they could return to their flat, provided that Remus keep a low profile for a while. He didn't specify for how long. This meant no order meetings and no missions. He wasn't even allowed to visit the Potter's house. For all intents and purposes, Remus Lupin had vanished off the face of the earth a month ago and never returned. "I bet he just wants to wait for the next full moon to get the all clear," Sirius suggested. "Anyway, you deserve a break." Remus just shrugged. "Served my purpose now, I suppose. They don't know what to do with me." "Don't talk about yourself like that," Sirius snapped irritably. They'd been stuck in the same tiny room for too long. They apparated back, and Remus began to feel a bit more himself once he really was home. The flat was immaculately tidy. Apparently Sirius had a lot of nervous energy while Remus was away, but otherwise everything was as it should be. No one was supposed to know that Remus was back, but of course James had told Lily and Peter, and Marlene had told Mary, so the first evening they were home, everyone came over at once. Luckily Lily had the presence of mind to bring food, because Sirius had nothing at all in the house. "Been eating at the Potter's," he mumbled bashfully. Remus and Lily went into the kitchen to set out sausage rolls, cheese and pineapple sticks, and sandwiches out on plates. Lily set down her carrier bags on the counter and flung herself at him, arms round his waist, head in his shoulder. Remus patted her gently when he realized she was crying. "Ah, Lily, please don't." "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice thick and muffled against his best woolly jumper. I just didn't think I'd ever see you again." "God, you're making more of a fuss than Padfoot." "Not likely," she laughed, stepping back and wiping her cheeks. "He was a complete wreck while you were gone. You wouldn't have recognized him. I don't even think he combed his hair." Remus felt a horrible stab of guilt. He didn't want to be gloomy in front of Lily, though, so he just gave her a breezy smile and said, "So, you've got something to tell me?" "Oh, when everyone's here." Lily was blushing and suddenly focused very hard on chopping up carrots for the dips she'd brought. It didn't take much longer for Marlene and Peter to arrive straight from work. Peter even had a briefcase now with his initials on it. Apparently he'd been doing all right for himself at the ministry, and Remus tried not to be too bitter about it. Marlene insisted on giving Remus another once-over in the bedroom, checking his ankle, which was as good as new, and his chest, which was much better. "Honestly, I can't believe you're still smoking," she tutted as he lit up, buttoning his shirt. "You know it kills muggles." "Die young and leave a pretty corpse," he winked at her, not trying to think about Hope's lung cancer. The fact was that smoking and drinking were the only things he felt like doing these days. Mary burst into tears as soon as she arrived and leapt into Remus's arms.
"You absolute bastard," she whispered.
"I could kill you." "Missed you too," Remus said, squeezing her back. Once they were all together, Sirius and James took over as host, which was a relief. Remus just felt suddenly very tired and sat on the couch like a ghost, watching his friends chatter and laugh and act like 19-year-olds for once. He just smiled at them all. Smiled and drank. Eventually the food was nothing but crumbs and the booze was running low too. James, Sirius and Peter had the idea to summon beers from neighbouring flats via the window, and the girls were trying to convince them not to, when Remus remembered what Lily had said in the kitchen. "What's your news?" "Oh!" Lily's head turned sharply toward him. She was standing by the window, arms round James's shoulders, trying to pull him away from his thieving attempts. James turned too, and they shared a sheepish look. "Everyone," James cleared his throat. Lily and I have something to... Oh, Christ! Mary said suddenly from where she was lounging in the armchair opposite Remus, legs flung over the arm. Lily, I thought you were on the pill. Mary! Lily turned an even darker shade of red. Not that! Phew! Mary laughed, closing her eyes. Because we're not even 20 yet. We're much too young to be thinking about... We're getting married! Lily yelped quickly before Mary could make any further comment. You could have heard a quill drop. Remus blinked a few times, watching James's face to check that it wasn't all a big joke, but he was beaming down at Lily with so much love and pride in those soppy brown eyes of his that Remus simply smiled to himself. Of course, he thought. Of course. Remus's second thought was Sirius, who'd been half leaning out of the window when the announcement broke. Now he spun round so fast he smacked his head on the frame. You what? He stared at James, a mix of surprise and displeasure on his face. Yep, James grinned, oblivious, wrapping his arms round Lily. She asked, and who was I to refuse? You asked, Marlene poked Lily. Bloody feminist hero, Evans. It was a bit more mutual than that, Lily laughed. We were just talking and... But we only just left school, Sirius said, his voice dull. A year ago, Peter reminded him, straightening the lapels of his green-checked blazer. You don't even live together, Sirius folded his arms. Remus felt trapped. These were all warning signs that Black was getting ready for a fight, except for once it was not Remus he was fighting with. I'm going to move in with James's family for a bit, Lily said, her smile faltering as she realised that Sirius was not sharing their joy. Yeah, you know how much they love having her around, James said. His voice had hardened and he kept his arms round Lily as if protecting her. She's been amazing while they've not been well. Have you really thought this through? I'm sure they have, Black. Chill out, Mary said, trying to lighten the mood. She got up. Shall I pop out and see if we can get some cheap fizz? This deserves a toast. Yeah. Marlene stood up too. She hugged Lily, then kissed James on the cheek. Congratulations, you two. Congratulations! Peter raised his beer can drunkenly. Have you all gone mental? Sirius shouted. Remus caught the look of dismay on Lily's face and decided that was enough. He stood up. Padfoot, he said firmly, using that voice. No. Sirius glared at him now. His mouth shut abruptly and he tossed his head like a moody teenage girl before pushing past them all and marching out of the room. The bedroom door slammed. Silly sod, Mary said breezily. I'll nip out to the shop. Come in, Miles? I'd better... Remus jerked his head in the direction of the bedroom and followed after Sirius. He didn't knock, just walked right in. After all, it was his flat too. Sirius was ready for him and started as soon as Remus closed the door behind him. You can't possibly tell me you think this is a good idea, he ranted, pacing the room. Prongs is being ridiculous. We're too young, there's a bloody war on, his mum and dad are ill, and he wants to have a fucking wedding. I think those all sound like good enough reasons to have a fucking wedding, actually, Remus sighed, sitting down on his bed. You're joking. We're kids. They're in love, Remus tried reasoning. Sirius laughed, a mean, cruel laugh. Oh, and you're going to start waxing lyrical about love, are you, Moony? Watch it. Remus stood up sharply, using his height to tower over Sirius. I don't know why you're being such a tosser to James and Lily, but I'm not going to sit here and have you fling bitchy little comments at me. Sirius was about to retort when the door swung open again, and this time James barreled in, angrier than Remus had ever seen him. You dick! He yelled. What the fuck are you playing at? Moony, don't defend him. I'm not, Remus said, stepping away and crossing his arms. I was saying the same. Well, James rounded on Sirius. Want to explain yourself? No, I want you to explain yourself, Sirius snapped. What the fuck? You're getting married just like that? I know you've had this mad thing for Evans ever since you were 12, but bloody hell, what's the rush? It's not a mad thing, James shouted. I love her. I've been in love with her forever. You know that. So you have to get married all of a sudden? I want to get married, and it's not sudden. We've been talking about it for ages.
First I've heard of it.
Yeah, well, I don't have to tell you everything. I didn't want to say anything until Moony was back.
What about your parents? What do they think?
Sirius was losing steam, but obviously not willing to stop being angry yet. They're thrilled, actually. They love Lily, and I thought you did too. You're my best friend. I thought you'd be supportive.
Oh,
Sirius's eyes gleamed.
Because you've always been so supportive of my relationships.
James's eyes flickered toward Remus, then back again. It was only for a split second, but Remus definitely felt it. What the hell was that about? You know that's not, James said fiercely, jaw clenched. Remus took that as his cue to leave. Whatever was going on between the two of them, he didn't want any part in it. He went straight to the kitchen and looked under the sink. There was a bottle of fire whiskey he'd put there after the last party for safekeeping. He uncorked it and took a long swig. Remus? He almost choked as Lily entered the kitchen. She laughed and reached out a hand. Give us some, then. Mum always said never to drink alone. He laughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve, and handed her the bottle. She drank deeply and didn't wince. Remus watched her with awe and thought that if you had to marry a girl, then she better be exactly like Lily Evans. Sorry I ruined your homecoming party, she said, forlorn. You didn't, Remus shook his head. Sorry about Sirius. Oh, don't be silly. You're not his keeper.
He's being a prat.
He's just jealous. I knew he would be. She laughed, catching Remus's eye. No, not like that, Moony. It's obvious he's madly in love with you. I mean, he's worried he's going to lose his best friend.
You're probably right.
I'm usually right. She raised an eyebrow at him and he laughed again. Congratulations, he said, sincerely this time.
I think it's brilliant.
Thanks, love, she smiled softly. It is a bit rushed, I know. My parents went spare. Pet was only married last year, and she's 3 years older than me, but... You know Euphemia and Monty aren't well.
Yeah, I wish I could go to see them, but Moody's orders, you know.
They understand. She touched his arm gently. Anyway, they're really... I mean, they're not suffering or anything, but they're very old. I knew how much it meant to James, having them see him with me. They want to know he'll be okay when they're gone. Maybe he had too much to drink, but tears pricked in Remus's eyes unexpectedly. He covered his face and groaned.
Jesus Christ, Evans, can't I have 5 minutes without an emotional breakdown?
She laughed and hugged him again. Lovely boy.
We're back,
Mary and Marlene sang as they stumbled into the flat once more, giggling merrily. Hide that, quick! Lily gave Remus his bottle back, and he stowed it under the sink behind a box of laundry powder. By the time Mary had poured everyone a glass, or a mug, of Babycham, the closest thing to champagne you get in Soho after midnight, James and Sirius had re-emerged from the bedroom, both still red-faced, but apparently on better terms. Sirius joined in the toast at least, and even gave Lily a polite kiss on the cheek. Still, the atmosphere had changed, and everyone left within the next hour or so. Marlene was staying over at Mary's in Croydon. Peter went back with James and Lily. When the door closed for the first time at 1 a.m, Remus felt like curling up on the couch, covering his head and staying there for a week. Sirius didn't say much, just did a bit of perfunctory tidying up, then went to the bathroom. Remus heard the lock click shut and took the opportunity for one last glass of whiskey and a cigarette before bed. He felt grimy. His teeth were furry, his throat scorched and his eyes itching, but it suited his mood. He didn't feel like talking anymore, especially if it led to another fight. He even considered just falling asleep on the couch. But then, that might just mean another fight in the morning, and he already knew he was going to be hung over then. Only one thing for it. Sirius unclicked the door and Remus heard him padding through to the bedroom. Maybe if Remus took his time brushing his teeth, Sirius would doze off before he got there. They both had a lot to drink. He hoisted himself off the couch and headed for the bathroom. Remus washed his face and the back of his neck in cold water and stared at himself in the medicine cabinet mirror above the sink. He'd been avoiding his reflection since he got back. He looked like shit. Still too hollow in the cheeks, eyes darker and wider somehow. He was pale too, from too much drink, and his scars stood out like silver wires under his skin. Did he have that same haunted look that they had? The pack? Had he caught that feral glint, that rangy wolfish smirk, or was he just seeing the angry, frightened care home kid that had always been there? He sighed, defeated, and flicked off the light, going to bed at last. The lights were still on, and Sirius was under the covers, only his silky black hair visible, draped over the pillow. He always slept like that, hidden. With a flash of clarity, Remus was reminded of the child Sirius had once been, alone in a big house full of family who couldn't understand him, the weight of expectations pressing in on all sides. Remus turned his loneliness inward, always had, but Sirius, he pushed his loneliness out and let other people take it from him. So he got a bit possessive sometimes, a bit panicky. So what? Nobody was perfect. Softening, Remus got in beside him and very gently stroked Sirius's hair. "All right," he whispered. Sirius's head bobbed in a short nod under the duvet, and he reached out to wind his arms round Remus's waist. Remus sighed, relieved. It felt so good to be back in his own bed. They could always just not fight, he thought to himself. "Love you," he murmured, kissing the top of Sirius's head. Sirius's arms grew tighter round him, and soon enough they were both asleep. Chapter 164. The War. Summer, 1979. Content warning. Gory war stuff as well as black family trauma. Lily and James's wedding was set for late September. It was going to be a relatively small affair, order members and school friends mostly, and it would be held at the Potter's estate. They were hoping the weather would be nice enough to have it in the gardens, but even if it rained, there was still plenty of room indoors. After making such a fuss on the night of Remus's homecoming, Sirius was clearly very embarrassed by how he acted, and made up for it by doing pretty much anything Lily and James asked of him. He ordered dress robes for the boys in Madame Malkin's, went to pick up the rings from the jeweller, and offered his entire record collection up for use at the reception. Remus, who'd never been to a wedding, tried to stay well back. As far as he knew, his duty as groomsman was to show up, keep Sirius's head from exploding, and make sure none of Lily's muggle family saw anything too scarring. Sirius's most bonkers act of contrition was to handwrite all of the invitations. His talent for calligraphy was still one of Sirius's darkest secrets, and Remus's favourite thing to tease him about, but he was determined to be the perfect best man, so he sat hunched over the dining table one afternoon and worked at it for a solid 4 hours. 58, Sirius said triumphantly, finishing the last invitation with a flourish of his quill. Well done. Remus glanced over the top of his newspaper. Ah, look at your pretty handwriting. So dainty. Better than your chicken scratch. Sirius poked his tongue out. Just don't tell anyone you did them, Remus advised, or you'll start getting requests. Do you really think they're that good? Sirius replied, holding one up to the light to inspect the delicate walls of black ink. They're gorgeous, really, Remus said fondly. Well, this is the only time I'm doing it, Sirius sniffed, tidying up the pile. This is the one and only wedding I will ever support. What if Mary got married? Or Pete? I'd show up and get drunk, but secretly I would hate every minute. Very reasonable, Remus nodded. Another thing you can blame the noble and most ancient house of Cack for, Sirius said. Do you know how many engagement dinners and weddings I've been to? Ugh. He shuddered visibly. I'm so sorry, Moony, but you'll never make an honest man out of me. Oh, and I was just about to propose, Remus said dryly, getting up. Tea? Please, Sirius nodded, rubbing his sore ankles. Remus entered the kitchen, tapping the kettle with his wand. They'd gone to get it the same day as the dress robes. It had reminded Remus a bit of going to get his school shoes as a boy. Ollivander measured him and then hummed and haahed and muttered to himself under his breath. He'd rummaged about in the stockroom and brought out box after box for Remus to try. Eventually they'd settled on a flexible cypress number with a unicorn hair core. He'd been trying to get used to it. It wasn't the same as Lyle's wand, which he found out had been blackthorn with a kelpie hair core. It seemed less rigid, more inclined to do what Remus told it, which meant that Remus had to remember not to put too much force behind his magic as he'd grown used to doing. He watched the steam rising from the kettle spout thoughtfully. It would really piss them off, though, Remus called through the thin walls. What? Who? Your family, Remus said, plonking 2 tea bags in 2 mugs. If you married a bloke, a half-blood werewolf bloke,
Don't forget poor, Sirius laughed. Merlin, just imagine sending my mother an invitation to that. Imagine sending anyone an invitation to that, Remus snorted. Christ, I can already hear James making horrible puns about the honeymoon. He carried the mugs of tea back to the living room, setting them down on the coffee table. I've already been engaged once. I really don't fancy doing it again, Sirius said with an air of finality. Oh, you're welcome for that, by the way, Remus winked. The wedding planning was actually a very warm welcome distraction as the summer opened up before them. Sirius, James, Peter and Lily were often called out urgently for order missions, and the list of missing read out at the beginning of every meeting was growing longer. Benji Fenwick, who'd been working with Moody for years, was horribly murdered. They couldn't even have a casket at his funeral. There wasn't enough of him left. Darius Barebones, who Remus had never liked, but who was nonetheless a dedicated agent, was found flayed alive in his own office at the Ministry. They were miserable times. Remus was finally allowed to return to the Order officially after 2 full moons had passed without incident. Ferox believed that the split Castor had instigated meant that Greyback's pack was too weak to be too much use to Voldemort, and somehow everyone had got the idea that Remus was responsible for this. Dumbledore actually shook his hand, saying, "You've done us all so proud, Mr. Lupin." Danny McKinnon had even apologised to him. Remus thought that was probably Marlene's doing. By July, the Order's numbers had dwindled so much that even Remus was getting sent out, and he was often paired with Mary, which made things bearable. Their general orders were to back up auras by standing guard or managing surveillance on some of the better-known Death Eaters. Remus and Mary spent a lot of time sitting in cafes together or hiding behind bushes. One such mission involved following a Death Eater called Travers, who was known to drink at a wizard's pub near Stoke Mandeville. They were supposed to see where he went, how he spent an average day. Caradoc Dearborn, a hero of the Order of the Phoenix, had last been seen entering the pub. No one had heard from him since. "You came back?" Mary whispered as they waited in the back street of an ancient Ford Cortina parked across the road. "So maybe Caradoc will too." "I hope so," Remus replied. "I just can't bear not knowing." Mary's leg was shaking nervously. "I keep imagining. And what they did to the Pruitts." "Don't think about it." He put a hand on her knee to keep her still and searched for a distraction. "Hey, did Lily decide on flowers in the end?" "Anything except lilies or petunias," Mary said with a grateful smile. "Me and Miles are wearing lavender, so whatever goes with that." "Sounds nice," Remus nodded, though he couldn't for the life of him picture the colour lavender. Was it purple or blue? "I'm so glad you're here with me, Remus," Mary said. "I can only ever get my defensive spells right in your study groups." "We're just here to watch. Everything will be all right." They waited for hours, and when Travers finally came out, staggering and reeking of spirits, he was not alone. Remus had to nudge Mary, who dozed off, lolling against his shoulder. "Oh, shit!" she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "6 of them, Remus!" Remus held a finger to his lips, signalling her to be quiet. He watched the Death Eaters spill out of the pub onto the quiet country road. He recognized a few of them from pictures Moody had shown the Order. Karkaroff, Dolohov, and Electo Caro. 2 of them he recognized by scent. "Fuck," he said under his breath. "It's Mulciber and Snape." "No!" Mary grabbed his arm, peering out to look. "Oh my God, we've got to get out of here." The problem was the car was just for show, and anyway, neither of them could drive. "Stay calm," Remus said. "We'll just wait for them to go. I bet they're going to "Oh! Muggles!" Electo Caro, a stocky, horse-faced young woman, pointed gleefully at the Cortina. "Let's play!" "Fuck," Remus said again. The 6 dark-robed wizards glided toward them, drawing their wands. Remus pulled his out too, Mary following suit. "Quick," he said. "Let's get out. Maybe we can—" "Aperio!" Travers whipped his wand at the car, and the doors ripped away, wrenched from their hinges with a horrible crunching metal sound. Mary screamed, but she kept her wand up. Remus pushed her backwards, shielding her with his body, and hoped they could get back out the other side. He felt much better with a car between them and the 6 dangerous killers. "They're not Muggles," one of the Death Eaters said gleefully.
Was it Mulciber? They are mudbloods. Ah, even better, Alecto cackled. Impedimenta, Remus yelled as he and Mary got free of the car. Loony Lupin, is that you? Snape now. What luck. Langlock! Mary cried with so much emotion that Remus heard the click as Snape's teeth snapped shut, and he clutched his jaw to both hands, unable to speak. Crucio! Mulciber shouted, aiming at Mary, but Remus jumped in quickly with a shield charm. Stupefy! Mary got Mulciber, but the others were still advancing, even Snape, though he was still disabled. Quick, Mary! Remus grabbed her hand and they disapparated, landing just about on their feet in the middle of Cardiff town square. Luckily it was so late that there were no muggles about, except for a very drunk-looking tramp who rubbed his eyes at the sight of them. Where are we? Mary asked shakily, her eyes huge. Doesn't matter, Remus panted. We need to do it again. 6 times to be safe, remember? Yeah, okay. She nodded, clearly in shock. Remus realised he'd have to do it again. He squeezed her hand once more and they were in Essex, only a mile or so from St. Edmunds. The landing was even harder this time, and Remus had to bend forward to stop his head spinning. Again, he grunted. I'll do it. Mary took his hand and dragged him, whirling through space once more. Next they arrived in an industrial estate somewhere, trucks and lorries parked outside big warehouses, glowing under faint yellow street lamps. Ugh! Mary pressed a hand to her forehead, wincing. Okay, again. The 4th time they had to cling to each other to stop from falling over. The 5th time they landed on their backs, thankfully in a grassy field somewhere in the Lake District. Remus hauled himself up, his legs practically jelly, his head spinning. He pulled Mary up too, and she stumbled against him, woozy. I'm gonna be sick, she said, then promptly turned round and threw up. Remus rubbed her back gently, blinking the sweat out of his eyes. You're doing well, he choked. Just once more. It was almost dawn when they got back to London, exhausted and queasy, heads throbbing. Mary stayed at their flat, saying she couldn't go to her mum's looking so rough. Sirius summoned Moody through the fireplace, and he arrived immediately, interrogating Remus and Mary, who sat shaking on the couch, wrapped in blankets and sipping weak tea. Excellent work, you two, he nodded to them before leaving. Keep it up and you'll both make it through. Mary burst into tears. It was bad all round. Remus and Mary's narrow escape that night was not their last, nor were they the only ones to find themselves in a tight spot. Remus frequently had to leave the room while James and Sirius recounted their misadventures, and Peter had developed a bit of a stammer when anyone mentioned Death Eaters. All told, the wedding felt like the only bright spot in their rapidly shortening futures. They certainly had their fill of funerals. So, in late August, when Remus and Sirius had an unexpected visit from Lily, who was in a state of panic, they immediately assumed the worst. Oh, thank God you're here, she said, bursting into their living room. Her hair was in a messy ponytail, and she looked overtired and overworked. What's the matter? Remus stood up quickly. Not you, she brushed him aside dismissively, then turned to Sirius. I need you. What's up? Sirius looked just as puzzled as Remus. Lily never needed his help. Is it Prongs? Yes, the bastard. The worry left Sirius's face and he smirked. Look, if this is about the stag do... Oh, I don't care what you get up to, she said impatiently. This is much more important. I'll put the kettle on then, Remus said, disappearing into the kitchen. He could still hear them through the wall. So what is it then? Sirius was asking. I can't dance. What? He scoffed. I've seen you dance. Yeah, I can shake my hips to pop music, but I'm talking about proper dancing, with steps and James leading and counting 1, 2, 3, the whole thing. Sirius was laughing now. It's going to be that sort of wedding? Prongs practically promised there would be modern music. There will be, Lily returned defensively. But, well, it's traditional to have a first dance, and I think his mum would like to see it. I agreed to do it ages ago. I thought, fine, we'll just stick on something soppy and just sort of cling to each other for a few minutes. But that wanker just actually mentioned the fact that he's been ballroom dancing since he could walk. Sirius snorted. Yep, that sounds about right.
Look, Evans, you're the one who's bonkers enough to marry a pureblood. You've made your bed now.
But you have to help me.
Oh, no.
Remus re-entered the room with a tray balancing 3 cups of tea.
Go on,
he said slyly.
I'd love to see this. Absolutely not.
Sirius folded his arms decisively.
Get Pete to do it. He's a pureblood too.
He's too short. Lily shook her head. And, well, I don't mean to be mean, but he's very clumsy, and I don't want him stepping on my feet while I'm breaking my wedding shoes. They're white satin. Please, Sirius. I'm a fast learner, I swear. You just need to get me through one dance.
Moony,
Sirius pleaded as Remus sat beside him.
Save me.
I think you should do it, Remus replied, sipping his tea.
For James.
Yes, Lily nodded enthusiastically. For James.
He doesn't deserve me,
Sirius grumbled.
Fine, 1 lesson. A waltz is easy enough. Moony, go away.
Absolutely not. Remus sat on the couch, settling in for the show.
I've never seen you do the waltz before, and I'm not going to miss it.
Sirius held up his middle finger, then tossed his head and turned to Lily.
Right,
he said haughtily.
Give me your hands.
As amusing as it first seemed, 15 minutes into the lesson, Remus was completely entranced. Sirius worked hard to hide his pure-bloodedness most of the time. Ever since they were kids, Remus had been aware of Sirius mimicking his accent and sometimes even his mannerisms in an effort to seem less privileged. He slouched, he swore, he wore ripped jeans and leather jackets. But here was proof that Sirius Orion Black, heir to the most prestigious and ruthless magical house in Britain, had not completely forgotten his roots. At the time, Remus found it charming, as he found almost everything about Sirius charming. He held his head high, showing off his long white neck and regal jawline. He took Lily in his arms like a real gentleman, like a courtly prince. When he moved, he glided, not a step out of place. He was the picture of incorruptible nobility. It drove Remus mad. Thank you very much, Lily gushed, rather pink-cheeked after 2 hours of dancing. I have to get back or he'll wonder where I am. But I seriously owe you one, Black.
Oh, just your firstborn'll do.
Sirius waved a hand, gallantly grinning. He looked like he'd enjoyed himself too. Lily grabbed her bag, kissed them both on the cheek, and left via the fireplace. Sirius turned to Remus, who was still watching them from the couch. He pulled a face.
Go on, then. Take the piss.
Never, Remus smirked, getting up and walking over to him. I love how fancy you are. He slung his arms over Sirius's shoulders and leaned in for a kiss. It went on a long time, Sirius pressing against him, affectionately at first, but then with more eagerness as the kiss deepened. Since Remus had returned from the pack, things had been a bit dry in that department. Not that they'd been monks exactly, but on the rare instances of neither of them was exhausted, sex had become pretty functional. Sirius grinned against Remus's lips, tilting his head back. Remus's hands were on Sirius's waist. His thumbs found their way under the waistband of his jeans, stroking circles on his hip bones that made Sirius squirm. Remus grinned too, pulling back. "Want to dance?" 3 days after the dancing lesson, Sirius and Remus found themselves with a miraculously free Saturday. There were no missions, there were no meetings, there were no wedding catastrophes to solve, and as far as Remus knew, neither of them were in mortal peril, so they spent it in the best way they could think of, sleeping. They had the longest lie-in since Hogwarts had finished, and it must have been almost 12 by the time Sirius got up to let the post owl in. It had been angrily pecking at their bedroom window for 15 minutes. The owl hooted indignantly, circled the room, then dropped the Daily Prophet on Remus's legs, while Sirius rifled around in the bedside table for a nut to give it. Remus rolled over, groaning. He considered covering his head with the duvet and just going back to sleep.
"Shall I do breakfast?"
Sirius said, picking up the paper.
"Breakfast in bed?"
"Have I told you how much I love you?" Remus smiled, eyes squinting open. He stretched a bit, yawning. "I think we've run out of eggs, though, so—"
"Remus!"
Sirius grabbed his arm so hard he'd have bruises the next day. He shoved the paper in his face, and Remus, startled, half awake, blinked at the headline. Black Heir confirmed dead. "Huh?" Remus scratched his head, confused. That's mental, you're not... Then it hit him. Oh, he felt so stupid. He looked up at Sirius, who was white as a sheet, eyes wide and pained. Oh, Remus said helplessly, reaching out. Oh no, Sirius. Chapter 165. The War. Dulce et decorum est. Sirius didn't speak again. At first, Remus tried to be understanding. He did everything he could think of. He got up. He made tea. Offered whiskey, though Sirius shook his head at that. He tried talking to him, but Sirius just stared at the article. Is there anything you need? I'll get you anything at all, just say. Nothing. Sirius just blinked and began rereading from the top. There was a photograph of a tall terraced house in a posh part of London, but Remus couldn't see much else, and Sirius was clutching the newspaper so hard his knuckles turned white. It was frightening. Remus stood beside him, reached out and touched his shoulder, which was stiff as a statue's. Sirius barely reacted. Remus left the room. He went to the front door where their jackets were hung, one soft and brown, one silver-studded black leather. He reached into the pocket of the leather jacket and pulled out the silver compact mirror inside. He cracked it open. Prongs? Prongs! James's face appeared, dark-eyed and concerned. Moony? It's Sirius. Something's happened. I know, James cut him off. I just saw the paper. I'll be 2 minutes. He vanished, and the mirror just flashed back Remus's own distressed face. Still, that was a relief. James would know just what to do. Remus hated himself for thinking it, but one thing kept blaring in his mind like a foghorn. Was it werewolves? Was it greyback? He needed to read the article. He needed to find out as much as possible. The fireplace suddenly blazed green and James stepped through, casting around. He looked at Remus. Bedroom, Remus said. James nodded and went straight through without a word. Remus closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He could make more tea. He really wanted a proper drink, but it was early in the day, and if Sirius didn't want any, then it would look pretty bad if Remus started on the gin. Fuck! Sirius had been so good when Hope died. How? At the time, Remus had taken it for granted, and now he couldn't think of a single useful thing to say or do. Regulus was dead. Sirius's brother was dead. Remus went back into the bedroom. James was sitting on the bed, an arm round Sirius, talking in his ear very low. Sirius looked as though he were only half listening as he stared into space. The paper had been dropped finally and lay on the floor, half under the bed. He made his choice a long time ago, James was saying. You mustn't blame yourself. You mustn't let this... It doesn't say what happened, Sirius said, finally speaking, his voice deeper than usual. Does anyone know? Your dad or Moody? Was there an attack last night, or... James shook his head, arm still round Sirius. No, nothing that would suggest... But of course we might have missed something. There's evidence that Voldemort's been killing Death Eaters to keep them in line. Some of them are having doubts, you know. Remus remembered the werewolf's sinister occupation. Perhaps Greyback hadn't been enough of a threat for some of the old families. Voldemort had to make an example. That made some sense. Apparently it did to Sirius too. His eyes focused, narrowing. He sniffed, though he hadn't shed one tear, and straightened his back, shrugging off James. Well then, he said brusquely. Got what he deserved, didn't he? James glanced at Remus and they shared a worried look. Mate, James said. He was your brother. It's okay if... No! Sirius stood up sharply, forcing James to get up too, staggering back against the wardrobe. He wasn't my brother. They're not my family. That was always made very clear. But you... He was my enemy. He'd have killed every one of us without a second thought. So I'm glad he's gone. One less Death Eater. Good. Brilliant. He looked at James and Remus as if challenging them. Neither of them dared. I'm going to take a shower, he said, and left the room. Remus gnawed his lip. James let out a heavy sigh. At least he's up, I suppose. Regulus, you little shit! It's like his final act was to mess with Sirius's head.
I know what you mean,
Remus said, trying to see the funny side.
It feels like any time things start getting back to normal, another catastrophe hits.
Moody would say, "That's war, lads," James replied just as humorlessly. They went quiet for a bit and heard the boiler in the bathroom grinding as Sirius turned on the hot water. James ran his fingers through his hair. "It'll be over for good one day. I know it will, Moony. We've just got to do our best until then." Remus nodded, and he did feel a bit better. James had that power. He could bring optimism to even the darkest hour.
"How are your folks?"
Remus asked, aware that James had left his sick parents very suddenly.
"They're okay.
Mum's panicking about flower arrangements. Pete and his mum are visiting, and Lily's there, so they're not alone. I didn't tell them about this. There wasn't time, and I don't want to put any more strain on them. They'd want to come over and check on them."
"And if he's decided to be like this about it," Remus said, "then I think it's best not to fuss too much."
"You're right," James said tiredly. He gave Remus a soft smile. "You were always right when it came to him, eh?" Remus shrugged, because he thought James was being awfully kind. Usually Remus thought he was doing a terrible job of taking care of Sirius. "I tried to contact Moody," James continued, back to business. "See if he knows anything, but he's not answering. To be honest," James lowered his voice, leaning in to confide in Remus, "I don't think Regulus was particularly high priority for anybody. It's only because he's a black that he ended up in the paper at all."
"You think it was Voldemort, though, who killed him?"
"Seemed likely. He's getting desperate, Dad reckons. No one thought the war would go on this long. It's not just our side that's flagging." They went through the living room and Remus made more tea. They were almost out of PG tips, and he scribbled down a note to pin to their cork notice board which hung beside the fridge. Once they sat down, Remus finally read the article in the paper. Black heir confirmed dead. Regulus Arcturus Black II, only child of Orion and Walpurga Black, has today been confirmed dead in a statement issued from the Black family home in Islington. Born in 1961, the heir to the Black house and fortune was 18 years old. He'd recently completed his education at Hogwarts School for Witchcraft and Wizardry, where he distinguished himself as an impeccable student and gifted Quidditch player. Regulus is survived by his parents and his cousins, who will attend a private memorial service later in the week. The family have requested privacy. That was all. There wasn't much else to say about such a short life, Remus supposed, and what had been said was largely untrue, or at least a smudged version of the truth. There was no mention at all how he died, but Remus thought that was probably a good thing. At least it definitely wasn't Greyback. The Daily Prophet wouldn't miss a chance to slip in a bit of werewolf bashing. Sirius came into the living room, hair dripping, towel round his waist.
"I think I'll work on the bike today,"
he said to the room, not really looking at either James or Remus.
"Go home, Potter. I'm fine."
And left again, presumably to get dressed. James and Remus looked at each other again. "Will you be okay?" James asked. "If I go?"
"Yeah, of course."
"Okay." James hoisted himself up out of the armchair and went to the fireplace. "You have the mirror if you need me. I'll pop back this evening."
"We'll be fine,"
Remus said, getting up to say goodbye.
"He just needs a bit of space."
"Don't give it to him," James said suddenly, looking Remus in the eye. "Moony, I need you to keep an eye on him, okay? Don't let him go anywhere. Don't let him try to get in touch with anyone he's related to. Except Andromeda, I suppose." Remus nodded. That wouldn't be too hard. Sirius never spoke to his relations.
"No problem."
"I mean it. He might do something stupid and we can't risk it."
Plenty of people still think Sirius is, untrustworthy because of his name, and something like this is going to... James pinked the bridge of his nose as if he was getting a headache. "Bloody Regulus,"
he muttered again.
"I'll look after him," Remus said firmly. "Don't worry."
"Thanks, Moony." James gripped his arm, and it was as if they were 13 again, juggling responsibility for their wayward friend. James left, and Sirius appeared at once, as if he'd been waiting.
"Were you talking about me?"
"Of course we were." Remus jutted out his chin. "We're worried about you."
"What did Prongs say?"
"That I'm not to let you out of my sight." Sirius snorted.
"You'll have to come to the garage then."
"Fine. Remus smiled breezily. "Lead the way." He was determined to do as James had instructed, if only because he had no idea how to be useful. Remus had only been to their shared garage once. There were a few things stored there, mainly Sirius's Quidditch kit and various childhood things that wouldn't fit in the flat. And the bike, of course. It was a Triumph Bonneville T120, the same as the one Sirius had first fallen in love with years at the Potters. He'd painted a lion on the tank and done some kind of enlarging spell on the body. Sirius pulled out a rag and polished it, though it was already glistening. Remus stood quietly by, watching. Sirius prodded it with his wand in a few places, oiled it in others. "When do you think it'll be finished?" Remus asked finally. "Ready to ride?" "Last week," Sirius replied, not looking up. "You what?" "It's done. Engine runs, flying function works. I'm finished. I think so, anyway. Haven't taken it out yet." "Why not?" Sirius just shrugged and resumed his polishing. Remus watched him a bit longer. Obviously, Sirius didn't feel like talking, and that was fair enough. Remus understood that better than most people. But he also understood the need to do something when you couldn't express yourself properly. "Let's go then," he said. Sirius, crouching in front of the bike, rocked back on his heels and looked at Remus. "Go? Go where?" "Anywhere you like," Remus shrugged. "Let's take it for a spin." Sirius blinked. "Really? You'll come with me?" "Well, I'm hardly going to let you fly off on that death trap alone, am I?" Remus laughed. "What sort of boyfriend would I be if I didn't follow you into the jaws of certain doom?" The ghost of a smile flickered on Sirius's face and he stood up. "Okay then," he nodded. "Let's do it." Remus had never liked flying. He was competent on a broom these days, but it had never been his chosen form of transportation. He just didn't like heights very much. Still, he would do almost anything for Sirius, so he clambered on the back seat and wrapped his arms round Sirius's waist and took lots of very deep breaths. Sirius actually laughed at him, which was progress. "Moony, are you sure you want to do this? I can feel your heart pounding." "Absolutely," Remus nodded, squeezing his eyes shut as Sirius gripped the handlebars. "I'm sure I've faced worse than your driving." "Well, if you're sure." Sirius revved the engine and Remus clung on tighter as the seat began to rumble. They went slowly at first. Sirius navigated carefully out of the garage, pointing his wand at the door so that it closed and locked behind them, then trundled slowly along the quiet back street. Then he flicked a switch and pressed down on his foot, and they sped away. Remus still trying not to look, his stomach doing backflips. "Here we go," Sirius called out, and Remus buried his head in Sirius's shoulder as they lifted off the ground, engine roaring as they gained height. Remus felt himself sliding backwards and yelped as his tailbone hit the metal back of his seat. "Christ!" he whimpered. He really was going to die. Sirius laughed again. "We did it, Moony!" he cried. "Open your eyes, you big wuss!" Remus did and instantly regretted it. They were a few 100 feet above the London skyline already. He could see the broad concrete rooftops and beige streets below. The people looked like tadpoles and the cars like beetles, and it was such a long way down. "Oh my God," he moaned. Sirius cheered happily. "Isn't it amazing?" He was facing forward, eyes on the horizon. It was blue skies as far as the eye could see. The wind rushed past their ears, cold and fresh, and Remus had to squint against the sun. "Amazing!" he shouted back, feeling quite sick, but pleased that Sirius was happy. They zoomed all over London for the better part of an hour, going as slow as Sirius dared along the winding Thames, taking sharp corners round skyscrapers, and almost crashing right into the dome of St. Paul's. Finally the engine began to slow, and Remus noticed they were losing height. He looked down bravely and squinted at the unfamiliar streets below. "Where are we?" "Islington." "What? Sirius!" Shit. He was supposed to be keeping him away from the blacks, and now they were headed straight for them. "Calm down," Sirius replied as they sank even further. They appeared to be aiming for a huge sketch of green space, a public park with trees and a lake and neat gravel paths around brightly coloured flower beds. The landing was less than perfect. They hit the grass so hard they drove great muddy tracks in it, and Remus was finally thrown from the saddle altogether, though he was so relieved to be back on solid ground he could have kissed the grass. "Bugger," Sirius said, cutting the engine and leaping off gracefully. I'll get better at that. You okay? He held out a hand to help Remus up. Fine, I think. Remus brushed his trousers and arms. Where are we? Highbury Fields. Sirius cast Obfuscate on the bike and then did his best to mend the ruined lawn. I used to come here a lot before I left home. Oh, right, Remus said softly. With Reg? Sometimes, Sirius sniffed. Our governess brought us. Remus decided to store away this revelation that Sirius had had a governess for another time. It's nice, he said, looking around at the lush green parkland. Pretty. Want to show me around? Sirius smiled at him gratefully, and they went for a quiet Sunday afternoon walk. Here and there, Sirius would stop and point something out. A tree he'd climbed once, or a bridge he'd hidden under. Remus enjoyed listening. He'd rarely ever heard any happy childhood memories from Sirius,
And for a little while he even forgot why they were there. They stopped by the war memorial. It was particularly fancy. Remus supposed because there was a fair bit of money in Islington. Atop the white plinth stood the green-hued statue of a young woman in ancient robes, holding aloft a laurel crown, an allegory for victory.
I did my first magic here, Sirius said with a grin, when I was 4. Really, what did you do? Set fire to her head, he nodded at the statue. Always been a rebel. Amazing, Remus laughed. Yeah, Justine, our governess, went mad trying to put it out, but we kept laughing, me and Reggie, and every time she extinguished it, I just did it again, because it made him so happy. Sirius looked down. He was quiet for a while, and Remus just put a hand on his shoulder to show he didn't have to speak if he didn't want to. They looked at the plaque on the memorial. How sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their country's wishes blessed. Remus couldn't help but wonder about the names of the men listed below. How old had they been? Robert Fenn, Peter Cross, Arthur Hill. Had they all thought they were doing the right thing? Had they all been brave in their last moments? Had they thought of their family, their brothers? When this war was over, would there be a plaque just like this in Diagon Alley? Whose names would it bear? Not Regulus's. Come on, Sirius said finally. I'm ready to go home now.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon or check out some of the official Bibliobabuli merch. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and until the next video, happy reading.